Good afternoon. Can you hear me okay, everybody? Hi, I'm Tom Ketchkamethy. I'm the Executive Director of the American Academy of Political and Social Science. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to our 7th annual Daniel Patrick Moynihan Lecture on Social Science and Public Policy. Very briefly, before we move into today's proceedings, I know we all want to hear from Ambassador Power. We're really pleased to see such a full house, as always. We're happy to be joined today by folks who worked with Senator Moynihan and to be joined by members of his family who have been so supportive of this enterprise from the start. I haven't seen Maura Moynihan yet, but she may be here. I know that she's going to be with us at some point today. Maura is Pat Moynihan's daughter, and she's been a tremendous supporter of our organization and of this initiative from the beginning. I'd also like to thank Sage Publications. Sage in the publishing world is probably the preeminent publishing house concerned with the social sciences. They also publish the title that we run out of my organization called The Annals of the American Academy. And they're also the principal co-sponsor of this lecture, having given us some generous funding to support this enterprise, so thank you to them. Also, a quick thank you to the Willard staff and to my staff at the American Academy. They've just been terrific in getting all this started. We are going to have a brief time for question and answer after Ambassador Power's talk. 2 points about that. One, it is going to be brief. We'll only have probably time for several questions, and I'd ask you to keep your questions succinct, to do your level best to not make them little mini lectures of your own or position statements, but actual questions. And second, please wait for a microphone to come to you. We're very pleased to know that C-SPAN was going to be covering us today, and we also have our own in-house tech staff, so wait to be able to be heard before you speak. That'd be terrific. And with that, I'll welcome Ken Pruitt to the stage to take us into today's proceedings. Ken is the Carnegie Professor of Public Affairs at Columbia University and a political scientist by training. He's also a former director of the United States Census. More to the point of today's proceedings, Ken has been a past president or a director in some sort of most every organization that's been influential in this country to improve the social sciences and advance their interests on the national stage. And he's also currently the president of the American Academy of Political and Social Science. So Ken, if you please.
Thanks, and welcome. And I will say just a few words about the Academy itself. It's about 130 years old. It was founded by people of the earliest generation, if you will, of the modern social scientists, which really didn't come along until about the 1880s. And the earliest, by the way, were all trained in Germany. We didn't have a research university in which to train them, but they did come in and helped our research universities get established for the social sciences. But they were peripheral, of course. They were compared to the humanities and the natural sciences. They were really immature as sciences and finding their feet. And the idea that they should have their own academy was an idea that came out of the University of Pennsylvania and launched it with the journal. And so it became the earliest journal in the social sciences that had the responsibility that Tom just mentioned of doing more than just reporting our research, but also reporting our research in such a way that it would, quote unquote, make a difference. And it's been very successful since. We don't make a lot of noise about ourselves, except about 12 years ago, the idea was, why don't we do at least one thing publicly every year for whomever. And you'll see later we elect fellows, and that became the Moynihan Award. And everybody knows that this was an unusual man. I have a quote that someone asked me to read, so I'm going to do it. The nation's best thinker among politicians and best politician among thinkers. And that's true. He went back and forth without any hesitancy, always carried his deep commitment to social sciences and getting the story right. And as I say, we started about 12 years ago with this award and the event. Alice Rivlin was our first awardee, and I mention that because many of you will know that she has passed away this last year. And so we do recognize that, and she was a great. I think I saw Becky Blank walk in, maybe? Yes, who's also a Moynihan Award, E. Did I miss anyone who's here today, right now? Oh, Haskins is here. Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, Ron, yes, please. Yeah. My immediate task is to get somebody else up here who can speak more, what's the right word? Eloquently than I can about our speaker, about Ambassador Power. I would say the 12th year of doing this, and for about half of those years, we were looking for somebody out of the international world. We wanted to recognize Pat's, of course, ambassadorship to the UN, and it was hard. One, the competition is very strong for these rare events. And we simply never came up with somebody who was in the international sector who we felt was senior enough and so forth to merit the award. And so you've done us a big favor, because I've been under lots of pressure from that contingent of the political science. Why in the world don't you get somebody? But Ambassador Power will be introduced by Avril Haines. Marvelous trajectory. When she stands up here, you won't recognize her to have a physics degree from the University of Chicago, and then you say, well, how in the world did that come about? But that wasn't enough. Then she went off and got a law degree at Georgetown, and is now at Columbia University. That's just an accident, not quite, but where she's extremely active in a number of initiatives that the Columbia University is engaged in, and so forth. And I won't go into those things, but I want to say a word or two about her own. She's out of the national security system under Obama. Make sure I get it right. Deputy director of the CIA, a legal advisor of the National Security Council, was a real player. She's a very modest person, and you would not know that was true of her. But she was a major player in the last go-round, and remains very active. And so, Avril, would you please take over?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Ken. Honestly, I'm incredibly grateful for the opportunity to briefly introduce Samantha this afternoon for her lecture as the winner of the Daniel Patrick Moynihan Prize, and in part because it's a real gift to have an opportunity to force Sam in a ballroom full of people to hear what I think of her, because she would never stand for the smoke I'm about to blow if we were alone together. But also in large part because I really believe this prize uniquely suits her. There are the obvious parallels between Moynihan and Samantha. They both have Irish roots, though Samantha was born in Ireland and is a proud immigrant. And they're both authors, although Sam, I have to say, insanely won a Pulitzer Prize for her book in her 20s after spending a year as a war reporter in the Balkans. And they were both Harvard professors, and she still is, and both served as the US ambassador to the United Nations. And moreover, like Moynihan, Samantha is an ideas person. She's someone who is intellectually insatiable on a range of topics and believes that the biggest problems causing human suffering in the world today can and should be solved. And they are both incredibly charismatic as people. But that really isn't what I was thinking of when I thought of her as being so well suited for this particular prize and for giving this lecture. Samantha exemplifies a leader who champions the use of informed judgment to advance the public good. And she's someone who has consistently sought, as I know Ken has, and the American Academy of Political and Social Science has, to further communication between the academy and the policy world, between scientific thought and practical thought. And I have no doubt that you'll see that today in her lecture. The importance she placed on evidence-based policymaking and the value of social science and academic research and rigor was obvious in her approach to decision-making, every memorandum she wrote for the president, in her interventions in meetings, and in who she selected to have on her staff when she worked at the White House or when she was ambassador to the United Nations. She is an intellectual who wants to face the really challenging questions, relishes doing so, no matter how hard those truths are, how complex those dilemmas are. But she combines that drive with an equally, if not more powerful drive to be effective and to produce impact. And in my experience, that truly is a rare combination. The first time I met Sam, she's not going to remember this, by the way, she was chairing a meeting in the White House on the Ottawa Convention, sometimes known as the Mine Ban Treaty. And I was a lawyer at the time at the State Department, and the scene was really quite striking. Here was this incredibly tall, red-headed woman who was a well-known human rights advocate, chairing the discussion on an arms control treaty in a room full of male military officers. And I suspect people had made a number of assumptions about her, about how she would run the meeting, which almost certainly were not the impression they left with that day. She had done her homework, as she always did, but more than that, she made clear that she wasn't there to advocate for the treaty, even though her position was clear. She wanted to understand their perspective. She had studied the report. She had really worked hard to unearth the data on these issues. And what she had were penetrating questions that made clear she was listening, wanted to understand what they thought about this, but also she wasn't going to accept people's views on faith. She wanted to be sure that whatever the decision was on this issue, that the discussion surrounding it would be rigorous. And moreover, characteristically, she knew and assumed that everyone had noble intentions, were trying to achieve the objectives that they believed to be critically important to the national security of the United States. But she was focused not only on that, but also on the means for achieving those objectives and the human consequences of those means, and forcing an examination of those issues in a way that I don't think anyone had yet done in that room on that issue. And as a colleague, you can't help to see Samantha is fierce, she is brilliant, she's self-reflective, sometimes to a fault. She's occasionally stubborn, but she's generous and kind and empathetic, while also being tough as nails when it comes to protecting people and in her pursuit of an ethical and better society. But something that makes her particularly suited to be a leader today and to promoting a dialogue between social science and policy is her focus on the human consequences of governmental action. And if you read her book, you'll see this reflected in spades. She's constantly asking herself, particularly as ambassador to the UN, and she talks about this, whether and how we are effectively integrating a concern for human consequences into our thought process, into our decision-making on foreign policy, and into national security. And honestly, this may sound obvious. For someone who has worked in government for years, I can tell you it's not. And even if you recognize it as being critically important, it's not easy to do. When you recognize it's sort of the traditional lenses that frequently simplify and ignore the consequences of our state-to-state interactions and on the human beings they touch. And I think in part, it makes it easier to sit in the sit room and make these hard decisions to do that. But it's also true that it's challenging to find ways on the timelines that you're making decisions and in the institutional structures that we have to actually tap into outside sources that give you a sense of what those human consequences are in the moment that's so critical. Yet today, I think, given the increasingly mobile, interconnected world we live in, where non-state actors are frequently as powerful, if not more powerful, frequently less accountable than states, decision-making that actually brings together and breaks down the barriers between those sort of governmental actors and the communities that they're working with across borders is more and more critical. And the human consequences we need to be taking into account are not simply the potential harms that people may suffer as a consequence of government action on particular portions of the population, but it's also, frankly, the opportunities that we can reveal and promote, but also how authoritarian societies can affect the societies, the people that are living in those societies. And I think, in short, Samantha's approach to thinking about these issues It's not only intellectually preferable, more likely to be sustainable and pragmatic, but it's something that we need today, and it's something that I think democratic societies have a real comparative advantage on. And I'm so proud and honored to introduce Samantha Power for her lecture for this wonderful prize, and I really appreciate that the Society has done this. It's remarkable. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. I'm so grateful to be here. Thanks to the American Academy of Political and Social Science, to Ken Pruitt for serving as president and for leading this incredibly important academy. And I'm looking forward to our discussion after. To Tom, who hounded me all summer to get a topic for this lecture and never did. So it'll be a big surprise for everyone here. And to Jessica Urfer for organizing this, which was no easy feat. Avril, I have to say more than a word about Avril, my former colleague and my dear friend. Avril, I think, brought to every governmental debate that I saw her participate in, and this is at the absolute highest levels of government, the freshest eyes of anyone I saw work in government. There were no taboos, there were no dumb questions, and talk about rare. It turns out that one of the things that constrains informed and rigorous policy debate is a sense that some questions are off limits, or a sense that certain things must be done a certain way. And while the position of National Security Advisor is famously, I suppose, the most stressful position there is in the national security establishment, the secret, the best-kept secret, and one of the best-kept secrets in Washington is that actually the Deputy National Security Advisor job is even more stressful because you're Mikey, you know, in the old cereal commercial. Everything that is hard comes to you, and Avril ran the fairest and most intensively determined and inclusive national security process I ever saw. And then, of course, made her way to the CIA, where she brought her background in international humanitarian law and her regard for human consequences into that institution, and not only, I think, changed many dimensions of how things were done in the intelligence community, but also won the fierce loyalty of intelligence professionals, just as she has everywhere she's worked in the government. And the main thing I'd say about Avril is the unfailing decency that she offers as a human being, as a person, as a friend, is what she wants to see reflected in American policy, in American public policy. So I couldn't be more honored that Avril was the one to introduce me. Thank you so much. And another word about Maura Moynihan, who I know a little bit. Thank you, Maura, for your support for this enterprise. She is here, she's there. Nice to see you, Maura. And I could not be more honored to be receiving this award in your dad's honor, and could not be more pleased and proud as an American and as a person who also lives in the broader world that there is an award named for your dad, that every year we come together to think about your dad and his legacy. And so, again, I'm incredibly proud to be here. Avril drew a few alleged parallels between me and Senator Moynihan. I don't flatter myself to believe that I necessarily belong in his league, despite, again, how pleased I am to be associated with him. But there are, as Avril noted, a few parallels that I do acknowledge. So both Daniel Patrick Moynihan and I do take pride in our Irishness, but part of that is that we, and I'm going to speak about him in the present tense because he's such a large force in our world still today, but we carry with it an expectation, an Irish expectation, that good things may not last. And you all remember after President John F. Kennedy was shot, Moynihan famously saying, I don't think there's any point in being Irish if you don't know that the world is going to break your heart eventually. And then he paused and added, I guess we thought we had a little more time, which is very moving and very poignant. I guess I spend my days with that same sense of worry about the world, especially these days, but I'm just hoping we have a lot more time, and not just a little more time. We both had the experiences of real noted toggling between academia, where we were each professors, and stints in public service, though he in a far more diverse range of roles in government and disciplines in academia than I. Serving in the White House, though, and sensing a certain skepticism at times about insights that I might have drawn from social science or behavioral science or political science, I often wished that I could mobilize a retort as lively as Moynihan could when he was being challenged. And of course, the incident that comes most quickly to mind in this context is that in 1976, when he was challenging the New York incumbent Senator James Buckley, and this was Moynihan's, I guess, his first political race, and when Senator Buckley pointedly referred to in one of the debates Professor Moynihan from Harvard, and then Moynihan famously exclaimed with mock indignation, "The mudslinging has begun." The mudslinging has begun. No dirtier mud than to be called professor in a political debate. We both believe in the essential role for ideas in the shaping of public policy, and also in the power of words. Never to diminish just the power of words. And finally, I feel one other great overlap, but this one is actually with Maura's mother, Senator Moynihan's spouse, the senator's wife of 48 years, Elizabeth Moynihan. She often said she married her husband because he was the funniest man she ever met. And I just want to say I feel the same way about my husband, Cass Sunstein, who is here today. Thank you for marrying me, Cass. So you know about his books, but you don't know about his humor necessarily. Some of those books have a little humor in them. So when one attempts to take the measure of Moynihan, senator, ambassador, veteran, author of 18 books, 9 of which he wrote while he was serving in the US Senate, presidential counselor, cabinet member, sociologist, professor, and public intellectual. What may be most striking of all in our era of intense polarization is his fierce independence of mind and spirit, which persisted throughout his decades of public life. How inconceivable would it be today for someone to do what Moynihan did, to get appointed to cabinet or sub-cabinet positions in 4 consecutive presidential administrations: Kennedy, Johnson, Nixon, and Ford. A former teaching assistant of his at Harvard, Bill Kristol, observed of Moynihan, "He's never in anybody's camp." A rarity today. So on the occasion of being recognized with this great honor, the honor of a lifetime really, I would like to address a problem that greatly concerned Moynihan when he served as US ambassador to the UN under President Ford. And that challenge, that concern of his, was the future of democracy. So today I'd like to examine first the contemporary state of democracy and its relative appeal around the world. I'd like to discuss the rise of China and its implications for the future of democracy. And thirdly, I will argue that facing a future in which these 2 very different models, the democratic model and the Chinese model, will coexist on this earth, I'd like to look at what we can and should do to enhance democracy's prospects. So, first on the state of democracy. Back in the fall of 1975, with the American bicentennial approaching, Moynihan, having recently left his role as ambassador to India and taken up his post at the UN, spelled out his pessimism about the democratic model in the US and around the world for an article in the Public Interest. What he wrote was, quote, "Liberal democracy on the American model increasingly tends to the condition of monarchy in the 19th century, a holdover form of government, one which persists in isolated or peculiar places here and there, and may even serve well enough for special circumstances, but which has simply no relevance to the future," end quote. Moynihan continued, quote, "It is where the world was, not where it is going," end quote. Now, for context, we should recall the world as it was when Moynihan offered this prediction. Across the globe, only about 30% of the countries in the world were democracies at that point. From the middle of the 20th century until Moynihan became UN ambassador in 1975, the number of democracies in the world had actually remained relatively and remarkably unchanged. So maybe it is understandable why Moynihan went on to observe in the article that, quote, "Increasingly, democracy is seen as an arrangement peculiar to a handful of North Atlantic countries plus a few of their colonies," end quote. Moynihan's views, however, had been particularly influenced by his experiences as US ambassador to India. He arrived in New Delhi in 1973, and during his 2 years in the country, he witnessed the world's largest democracy experiencing painful backsliding. In late 1974, as he prepared to leave India and return to the US to become UN ambassador, he wrote in his journal, quote, "Here, in India, here, liberty displays an uneasy presence, an endangered species, a threatened environment. That Indian democracy should have to struggle to maintain itself is the natural condition of its being. All democracies have this struggle. What troubles me so is to find it struggling to maintain its reputation in the world. The heart has gone out of it. We no longer believe that liberty will prevail. Not here, not, I suspect, much longer in Western Europe, not, I fear, very much longer in the United States," end quote. Soon after, Indian Prime Minister Indira Gandhi had a state of emergency declared, suspending elections, arresting political opponents, and cracking down on civil liberties throughout the country. The emergency, as it came to be known, would last for over a year and a half. So, Moynihan's belief that democracy was, as he put it, where the world was, not where it is going, derived from his lived experience. He was, of course, mistaken. The third wave of democratization was beginning just as he issued these dire predictions. While Moynihan was understandably focused on India, an uprising was occurring in Portugal. After 42 years of military dictatorship, the Carnation Revolution there led to a transition to democracy. What followed, as all of you know, was 3 decades of democratic flowering around the world. By the time of Moynihan's death in 2003, the percentage of democracies in the world had more than doubled. Some 65% of the countries in the world, 117 out of 191, were democracies. And of course, Moynihan himself relished this development. Not long after the fall of the Berlin Wall, Moynihan wrote to George Kennan, quote, "You must be so enjoying the spectacle of the world turning your way. Well, it only took half a century," end quote. In the span of just a few decades, democracy had become the dominant form of government around the world. Today, however, gloomy prophecies resembling those that Moynihan issued a half century ago have surfaced anew. We are confronting what has become known as the Democratic Recession. We are seeing a pronounced surge in support for populist nationalist figures around the world. Major established democracies are currently on the defensive, chastened by the seeming disillusionment with democracy around the world, intimidated, it seems, by China's success, and distracted by the everyday difficulty of conducting even basic governance. Dire warnings that democracy is in crisis, even in its death spiral, have become almost inescapable. Think of the books that we are reading. How democracies die, how democracies end, the people versus democracy. Even Cass contributed. Can it happen here? Authoritarianism in the US. At least he had a question mark. Madeleine Albright's Fascism, a Warning. Many Americans share the intuition that our democracy is inexorably in decline. Polls suggest that a sizable percentage of the American public has lost faith in democracy, finding, for example, that 55% characterize democracy in the US as weak, and 68% believe it is getting weaker. Polling of Americans aged 18 to 29 finds that almost 2/3 are, quote, fearful about the future of democracy, end quote, in the United States. These sentiments are given additional credence by the disposition and rhetoric of our current president, who, in addition to his assault on democratic institutions like the media, the courts, and his political opposition party at home, has, in terms of his foreign policy, removed the reference to democracy from the State Department's mission statement, repeatedly proposed cutting billions of dollars from long-standing democracy promotion initiatives, and has shown greater affection for the leaders of the most repressive countries in the world than he has for our democratic allies. So, is democracy doomed? I don't think so. But let's examine the facts, as democracies are suffering more than a crisis of confidence. The global expansion of democracy, the third wave of democratization that began with that Carnation Revolution in Portugal, has ended. Although the experts and the rankings differ on the margins of exactly when this began happening, and they differ on how serious the trends are, the best studies and assessments of global democracy, if you take them together, show that in the last 10 to 15 years, democracy has experienced more setbacks than gains. This is a reversal of 3 decades of essentially uninterrupted progress and democratic gains. According to Freedom House, as many of you know, we are now in the 13th straight year of freedom in decline around the world. And in the past 3 years, it has been established democracies, those countries like the United States that are considered fully free in the Freedom House Index, which showed the worst setbacks. Instead of rule of law, something that the United States has been promoting for many decades, or seeking to promote, the Carnegie Endowment has documented how more than 70 governments in the last decade have instituted rule by law, so not rule of law, rule by law, taking a number of serious measures to restrict civil society through legal means like regulation or the curbing of financial assistance to those organizations. Parties and politicians that were once at the periphery due to their extreme views now occupy influential roles in many established democracies. From these more mainstream positions, they often demonize immigrants and refugees, attack the press, and do what they can to undermine the judiciary and the checks and balances that exist on centralized power. Today, for example, 90% of the media in Hungary is owned or controlled by allies of President Orban and his Fidesz party. In Poland, the Conservative Law and Justice Party came to power in 2015, and in 2018, the party passed a law that forced the retirement of long-serving Supreme Court judges who were then replaced by allies of the ruling party. Critical reporting is now dismissed as fake news, not just by President Trump, but by leaders in dozens and dozens of countries. Whether in Brazil or the Philippines, right-wing populists who control the levers of government have already caused serious setbacks for open and democratic societies. And the most recent Pew polling of global attitudes across 27 democracies has found that overall more people are dissatisfied with how democracy is working in their country than satisfied. Now I'd like to turn to the rise of China and how this fits into the picture. For those searching for an alternative, the most prominent out there is, of course, the authoritarian capitalism practiced in China. President Xi has been explicit about China's desire to provide an alternative model that does not imitate Western values. He has said, quote, "China offers a new option for other countries and nations who want to speed up their development while preserving their independence," end quote. Now, the word independence here is shorthand to signal other countries that China will not be butting its nose into their internal human rights practices. Although China has lifted millions of people out of poverty, its governance model has deeply disturbing aspects. Beijing has locked up between 800,000 and 2 million Chinese Muslims in internment camps, framing the measure as what it calls effective counterterrorism. It has, of course, banned many of the world's most popular websites, including YouTube, Facebook, Google, Wikipedia. It has treated desperate people fleeing gulags in North Korea as criminals, not refugees seeking asylum. And, in the most Orwellian development, perhaps, in the coming years, China plans to have assigned a citizen score to every one of its people. And this citizen score will use artificial intelligence to process a mix of information about Chinese citizens' movements, purchases, social media postings, religion, and the records of their family members and friends. The government will then use this continually updated score to classify citizens as safe, normal, or unsafe. This score will in turn be used to determine everything from citizens' access to jobs and social services to whether they should be picked up for preemptive questioning or be allowed to travel. Already, the Chinese government has revealed that due to bad social credit, it has blocked its citizens from taking flights 17 million times. Under President Xi, China has capitalized on its economic heft to turbocharge its diplomacy and its international development, two cornerstones of American power since the end of World War II, and tools that we have used over the years to support the consolidation of democracies. China's foreign affairs budget has doubled since 2013. This is as the State Department budget stagnates and as career diplomats flee an administration that has generally shunned their expertise and even the practice of diplomacy. Greatly enhancing Chinese influence, it now provides just as much development financing as the entire World Bank. As of 2018, some 20% of African governments' external debt was owed to China. At the United Nations, the US remains the largest donor and, at least for now, wields the greatest influence. However, China overtook Japan just this year as the second largest contributor to the UN regular budget. It already contributes more peacekeepers than any other permanent member of the Security Council. Gallup polling across 133 countries shows that President Xi is now viewed as favorably as, or more favorably than, the American president. And while people around the world are more or less evenly split about whether they hold a favorable or unfavorable view of China, its favorability numbers are relatively high, particularly in the developing world and among younger generations. In countries like Tunisia, Nigeria, and Kenya, all countries that the US would like to see continuing their progress in shoring up democratic institutions, views of China today are markedly positive. Meanwhile, in Brazil, Mexico, Poland, and even Australia, double-digit gaps exist between those in this 18 to 29 range who have a favorable view of China and those from older generations, particularly over 50, who are much more skeptical. Authoritarian capitalism is, in its way, ascendant. As Roberto, Stefan Foa, and Joschka Munk have pointed out, within the next 5 years, the total GDP of countries that Freedom House considers undemocratic will surpass that of Western democracies. The combined economies of democratic countries like the US, Germany, France, and Japan, they write, will be smaller than those of autocracies like China, Russia, Turkey, and Saudi Arabia. The implications for the world are, of course, serious. A powerful argument for democracy has always been that accountable governance and economic development go hand in hand. For leaders wavering on whether to become more open and citizens deciding what kind of society they hope to build, the appeal of democracy has always been tied, in part, to its ability to deliver for people's quality of life and economic well-being. China's well-documented economic success, combined with a global awareness of the growing inequality inside democracies, has complicated this long-standing argument. All of this said, we do not yet know how aggressive Beijing will become in trying to use its leverage and its assistance beyond its borders to nudge countries on the fence or democracies that are backsliding in a more repressive direction. We do not know whether they deem it in their interest to paraphrase a former American president, make the world safe for autocracy and authoritarianism. We don't know if that's their aim. During my time at the United Nations, I saw competing impulses among Chinese diplomats. On the one hand, China's internal stability remained its government's overriding concern. Over many decades, US diplomats have recognized that our national security is enhanced by a more democratic world in which we have more democratic partners to enlist in meeting shared challenges. China sees domestic security as the most important foundation of its national security. Yet, in a number of areas, I also saw China stepping in and stepping up to influence countries on issues where the United States has enduring interests. And now, when the United States has vacated a leadership role, that tendency has been dramatically accelerated. While many expect China to actively pull countries in its direction, to not be agnostic about the form of governance that countries it's providing assistance to have, others, like the historian Arnie Wested, argue that Xi Jinping's China is nationalist, not universalist. The Chinese government has a lot on its hands, governing a country of 1.4 billion people. It may present itself as an alternative model to Western democracy, but for the time being, its main approach may be to show that China's system works better in China than America's system works in America. Regardless, our former colleagues from the Obama administration, Jake Sullivan and Kurt Campbell, wrote recently in Foreign Affairs, quote, China may ultimately present a stronger ideological challenge than the Soviet Union did, even if it does not explicitly seek to export its system. If the international order is a reflection of its most powerful states, then China's rise to superpower status will exert a pull toward autocracy, end quote. China is also not the only country pulling the system in that direction. Today, far more players are on the scene actively promoting their political visions than did so during the third wave of the 1970s to the 1990s. And many of them are operating with a range of impressive tools that match or exceed what established democracies are currently offering: development aid, military assistance, diplomatic heft, and media influence. Part 3 of all of this, what can be done? And here I have a few ideas. Obviously, the challenges that I've laid out are going to require more than a few ideas to be met. But for starters, the most critical step for Americans to take is to focus on our own deeply divided democracy. There are many impediments that stand in the way of improving the health of our democracy. Big money in politics, gerrymandering, restrictions on voting rights, downright corruption, and it's very much related to all of the above, deep and ever deeper polarization. It sometimes seems not to have fully penetrated just quite how destructive this polarization is and how difficult it has made meeting any problem, much less making a dent in a problem as big as a global human rights recession. The salience of political identities in our country is now far greater than the salience of all we have in common as Americans, as classmates, as neighbors, as citizens. Whenever a fresh issue arises, we see almost an instant polarization now. Just this week, one of the nation's leading opinion pollsters, the Institute at Monmouth University, found that only 40% of Republicans believed that President Trump had talked to Ukrainian President Zelensky about investigating Joe Biden. Only 40% of Republicans believe that. Now, this means that the majority of Republicans said that Trump either didn't talk to Zelensky or that they couldn't be sure. But this is in spite of the fact that the president stated openly that he did, and despite the fact that the Trump White House released a partial transcript of the call between them. These somewhat baffling divisions are, of course, mirrored in our Congress. Polarization has made the legislative branch immensely ineffectual and even irrelevant when we are faced with a major challenge. When a gunman kills 58 people at an outdoor concert, the baseline expectation is that our Congress won't do anything to try to decrease the risk of future attacks. It used to be that international treaties were ratified with bipartisan support in Congress, but that has changed. The Bush administration, George W. Bush's administration, ratified 163 international treaties, some with the help of Avril Haines. The Obama administration, we managed 20 international treaties. The Trump administration, so far, just 9. On this front, the front of polarization, that is, I was profoundly disheartened after learning of the Supreme Court's 5-4 ruling this year that federal courts could not put a stop to partisan gerrymandering. This was a rare opportunity to do something that would have had a real impact on the health of our democracy. Instead, the majority on the court said it was acceptable for politicians to continue choosing their voters rather than having voters choose their politicians. Over half of congressional districts nationwide are still drawn by legislatures whose elected representatives tend to prioritize keeping their jobs over other priorities. Thus, in North Carolina, during the 2018 midterms, for example, Democrat and Republican candidates each won about half of the votes cast, yet Republicans ended up winning 10 of the state's 13 seats in the House. Manipulating district boundaries for political gain is, of course, practiced by Democrats too, notoriously in states like Maryland and New Jersey. As a result of all this gerrymandering, primaries end up being the only important election in so many districts, and the increased importance of the primary often favors candidates who represent the extremes. This can still be fixed, but it is up to state courts and legislatures to right this structural wrong. Second recommendation, as we enter a period in which, broadly put, these two models of government are competing for adherence domestically and geopolitically, we must rebuild our diplomatic corps and put ourselves in a position to rejuvenate and strengthen alliances among democracies. At present, the Pentagon and armed services have more than 225,000 American personnel deployed outside the United States. The State Department, around 9,000. Indeed, the Pentagon famously has only slightly fewer people serving in marching bands than the State Department has diplomats. We still do not have ambassadors posted in more than 40 countries around the world. The battle between the democratic and authoritarian model is going to play out in the international domain over the coming decades, and we need to be resourced for that battle. In the years after the Arab Spring, I believe that we and our allies should have done more to help, for example, a country like Tunisia, as it tried to consolidate the hard-earned democratic gains achieved by the protest movement that began in 2010. Today, when a new leader in Ethiopia negotiates peace with its neighbor, releases political prisoners, opens up freedom of the press, and appoints a cabinet with a 50-50 gender balance, declaring that his ultimate goal is, quote, to ensure that a democratic election takes place in Ethiopia, end quote, we and other democracies should be supporting his agenda. In Sudan, when an incredibly courageous and persistent protest movement forces the military leadership into signing a power-sharing agreement, we should be working with them to improve their chances of getting military leaders to hold to that agreement. Even now, with the Trump administration AWOL and also lacking in credibility in promoting human rights and democracy, the US Congress can play an important role by using the laws we have on the books, including the bipartisan 2016 Global Magnitsky Act that sanctions human rights abusers around the world, and the Foreign Assistance Act, which requires that the executive branch cut off assistance to governments that take power through military coups. As Tom Carruthers has recently argued, the Congress could also pass a new law that would limit U.S. aid to leaders who get rid of constitutional term limits, a growing trend. My third and final recommendation is that we have to get our mojo back, and we have to be prepared to defend democracy. Taken together, the decline in freedom around the world, which is, borne out by the data, and the inexorable rise of China has deepened a confidence gap that seems to have overtaken our world. Our authoritarians seem to be strutting around, although their model, as I will argue in a second, rests on very fragile foundations. Democrats, meanwhile, at times seem to be running for cover. I confess I bring an inherent skepticism to sweeping fatalism and to overwhelming optimism. When I graduated from college back in 1992, a book about the global triumph of liberalism, Francis Fukuyama's The End of History and The Last Man, had spent a month on the bestseller list. I gave you earlier the list of the best-selling books on the perils to democracy that we're reading today. Today, as our reading list suggests, people have begun speaking of liberal democracy's demise with the same certainty that people back when I graduated from college talked about liberal democracy's inevitable triumph. And it seems like we should not make the mistake of replacing one narrative about inexorability with its doomsday opposite. My own view is that notwithstanding everything we are confronting here in our country and in other democracies around the world, we have the better model. There was a logic to Churchill's claim that democracy is the worst form of government except for all those other forms that have been tried from time to time. In autocracies, economic growth is likely to be impeded by stagnant state-owned enterprise, a lack of transparency in the economy. Even in China, we've already seen growth slowing, and one wonders how secure will investors feel over time with the arrest of expatriates and the absence of due process and property rights. Autocrats, as we've seen through history, often overreach. They tend not to hear from critical voices in their inner circles, and they often prefer the company of sycophants. If you worked for President Xi in China or President Orban in Hungary, you would likely be reluctant to be the bearer of bad news to your leader. These are not systems that embrace the logic of the team of rivals. In the military, the most capable officers in such systems may be less likely to rise than the most loyal. The lack of accountability when you have endless terms or you are president for life can breed all kinds of decay. And because ethnic, religious, and national identity is often stymied in illiberal systems, it frequently leads to social unrest and even violence. While innovation today is flourishing in some sectors within certain autocracies or authoritarian systems, I think we have reason to question whether innovation will be undermined in the long term by the absence of freedom of speech and the presence of so much fear. And finally, one of the biggest factors explaining the appeal of illiberal or populist leaders in democracies is inequality and the feeling of many that they are being left behind by their governments and by society. And this trend may well be one that only increases with automation and some of the other structural features of our economy. But there is no reason to expect that systems that concentrate power at the very top will more equally distribute benefits or will not leave people behind in an age of automation. And even today, we must remember that democracy remains, and this is counterintuitive given some of the statistics I gave you earlier, but democracy remains today the dominant form of government in countries around the world. Some 55% of states today are democracies, and they are home to more than half of the global population. Moreover, despite the very real and worrisome backsliding, if you look at all four of the most widely used and accepted databases that assess democracy over time, and since we have so many political scientists here, I will describe those databases: Freedom House, VDEM, the Polity 4 Project, and the BMR Coding of Democracy. The percentage of democratic countries in the world, according to, again, to those, is either at or at least near its all-time high, reached just after the end of the Cold War. And the reason for the reason that can be true at the same time you're seeing all the backsliding is that countries are still considered democratic even as you see setbacks in terms of rights enjoyment and the various freedom indexes. I would also call attention to a trend that hasn't quite registered yet, it seems, in our public imagination, that political participation is now increasing in almost every region of the world. Voter turnout is up. The number of people who say they are following the news, engaging in politics, and joining political parties is up. By many measures, the engagement and participation of women in politics has increased substantially. The proportion of the population willing to participate in peaceful demonstrations is also rising, and this is not only in democracies, this data. We have seen recently in Turkey the people of Istanbul delivering a stunning rebuke to President Erdogan twice in a row, first electing a member of the political opposition as mayor in Erdogan's home city and base, and then, when Erdogan's party forced a revote to try and manipulate the results, the population elected the opposition candidate again by a margin almost 60 times that of the initial victory in the first race. In Hong Kong, people of all ages are standing up for the rights and freedoms that are central to their city. In Moscow, thousands upon thousands of Russians have taken to the streets repeatedly this past summer to demand free and fair local elections, despite arrests and harassment. In Slovakia, a young environmental lawyer who has never held political office and who was vocal on women's and LGBT rights became president this past summer, loudly proclaiming her support for European integration and triumphing over entrenched and reactionary political parties. Her victory showed, she said, quote, that values such as humanism, solidarity, and truth are important to our society, end quote. 6 months after Algerians first took to the streets to peacefully demand political reform, the country's longtime president resigned, and after initially trying to rush a presidential election, the country's interim leaders have bowed to public pressure, postponing that election. Despite the stalemate, the tens of thousands of people participating in weekly demonstrations have held fast to their demand for a democratic transition. Sudanese protesters, who I mentioned earlier, toppled Omar al-Bashir. The once untouchable president is now standing trial. And we have seen elements of this, of course, in the United States. The 2018 midterm election saw the highest overall turnout for a midterm in 50 years. College students more than doubled their turnout from 4 years earlier. The surge in political activation of young people manifested also in the marches for addressing climate change and for addressing gun control, shows that the next generation is engaged in pushing back against the status quo. As my Kennedy School colleague, Erica Chenoweth, has recently shown with her fascinating research on social movements, quote, we live in a decade in which there have been more mass nonviolent movements around the world than at any time in recorded history, end quote. Interestingly, after years of reports that highlighted the global trend of democratic backsliding, the most recent Democracy Index released by The Economist noted that it had not registered an overall decline in global democracy for 2018. Now, this is not exactly a great data point to hang our hats on. The report, of course, goes on to detail many of the worrying trends impacting democracies, like the erosion of civil liberties. But it highlights the explosion of political participation, pointing to developments like the ones I have just described, saying that the surge in engagement is one of the defining changes currently taking place on the global stage. So all we can say with certainty, it seems, is that the future of our societies and the role that governments and citizens will play in shaping them is being actively contested. Despite all of the challenges and setbacks, people appear to have an inexhaustible aspiration to hold their leaders accountable. It is far too early to write the story of democracy's fate in the 21st century. When Moynihan despaired about the future of liberal democracy, as I indicated earlier, he wrote, again, quote, it is where the world was, not where it is going, end quote. But in closing, I would stress that where the world is going is not already scripted. It will be decided by the resilience, the will, and the actions of the people who comprise the countries within that world. Notwithstanding all of the grave structural challenges before us, when it comes to a cause as vital as the future of democracy, we must resist the temptation to spend our time admiring the problem. Rather, we must urgently work for the world we seek. I thank you.
Around in my head in terms of where we want to cut into this. Could you take us all the way back to Moynihan's reservations about what was he seeing, what signals was he picking up that led him to that sort of rather unexpected, it could all crumble?
Well, I don't have much to add beyond what I described, which was he was watching in India. They were on the verge of a state of emergency. He was also seeing ethnic and religious tensions flaring up in big ways. But above all, 70% of the countries in the world were not democratic, and it hadn't changed since the founding of the UN.
If he were here tonight and we were querying him about it, and we wanted to say, well, where were the social sciences? What were they saying? Whose fault is it if we're not able to hold on to the democracies that we've created? Where does the intellectual foundation come for preserving liberal democracy, if not somewhat out of our investigations and our arguments and so forth and so on?
Well, you know, I'm not a social scientist or a political scientist, but I think what I tried to do when I was in government and what I tried to do today is draw on the incredible work that's being done by scholars throughout our country and around the world who are looking at these trends and trying to drill into them and trying to understand where they come from. I mean, I think there are a lot of different aspects to this. One is the question of citizenship and political participation, which of course has, you know, and voting rights and all the dimensions of voting. You know, it is the case, as many of you know, that 9% of the people who voted for Barack Obama in 2012 shifted to voting for Donald Trump in 2016, but moreover, 7% of the people who voted for Barack Obama in 2012 stayed home in 2016. And so these trends are kind of up and down, and it can be events that motivate political participation, but understanding those individuals and what is motivating them, I think, is really important. Finally, you're seeing scholars, I think, turn also to what has been a very unaccountable and understudied sector of our society, which is the tech world. Alongside that, you finally see regulators also paying some attention to the tech world in the face of public outrage. But far more scholarship, I think, can be done on that. I mean, you now have, at its height of its economic worth, Facebook was worth more than 167 of the 193 countries in the UN. I mean, it has more adherents than Christianity, and yet, while we have scholars who study countries and local government and state government and federal government, again, understanding Facebook as a player akin to one of the most powerful countries in the world, and yet without any kind of democratic accountability within it, I think is an example of where scholars can go.
The reason I come back to it a little bit is that we and the social sciences had an enormously robust half-century from when Pat would have said what he was saying. It started in the 60s, coming out of the war effort. We had some status, and we began to really dig into certainly the social welfare problems of the United States and so forth. My friend Norman Bradburn here tells me that Jim Coleman really was the person who launched big science for the social sciences. 600,000 students, 60,000 schools, teachers, so forth, on the racial crisis. And Pat was very involved in that, as a matter of fact. He organized a meeting at Columbia, at Harvard, because there was some sort of skepticism about Coleman's findings, and the judgment that Moynihan and the people he brought in was that no, he was right. And it was a really major breakthrough. And remember what Coleman reports, that the issue is community and family, we can't solve the education problem by just throwing money at it. We really have to have so forth. But just from that became then a huge, enormous explosion of social science, doing field experiments and so forth. And yet, I guess I want to put it this way. Somehow we must have failed. I don't want to overstate that, but we were surprised by the 2008 recession. We didn't see it coming. How in the world could we have missed Trump? Something like that big and that dramatic and that transformative. We weren't sitting around tables like this worried about that happening to our society 10 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago.
I think there are a number of dimensions in which we in the Obama administration were blindsided also by major events internationally that are, I think, analogous to what you're describing. I think it's absolutely fair to say that almost nobody saw the Arab Spring coming, and this was, a tinderbox waiting to explode. The extent to which Putin's grievances were going to translate into a militarized aggression of the extent that he carried out. On issue after issue, we're being surprised. I don't think that is a summary indictment of generations of work by social scientists by any means. It's cause, though, to ask why, in those particular cases, we were blindsided. And so, for example, this is not my area, so I'm a little bit out of my depth here, but one conclusion that one could draw, particularly about how both in government and here perhaps we were blindsided by the degree of support a candidate like Trump could draw, and particularly that's why I focused on the shift from Obama to Trump. That delta is a very significant delta, and that might be cause to ask oneself: are we doing enough applied work? Are we out there actually, identifying the places where different dimensions of globalization and the sort of rub of our international economic approach and our domestic economic policies and the absence of a sufficient safety net, where those issues are hitting home? Even when I look back, I think, why didn't we see that the opioid epidemic, in a way, was itself a preview on one level of just the despair, and alongside the despair, often a rage that can exist. So I think there can be a question of whether one is too cloistered in foreign policy. We're asking ourselves the question of, as a kind of constituency for U.S. leadership in the world seems to be dwindling. The question we ask ourselves is, and this applies also to people who do, international relations and other sort of foreign policy related dimensions of political science and international history, but have we just been talking to one another? Have we missed the ways in which various mistakes that have been made by successive administrations in foreign policy has brought about such widespread disillusionment? Have we missed the ways in which sort of war has become conflated with foreign policy in some people's minds, or the negative effects of free trade have been conflated with U.S. leadership in the world in a manner that makes people then skeptical of U.S. leadership? So, I think there's a lot of looking inward that needs to be done, given the predicament that we face. But I think to focus on any one individual or even Trumpism would be, a mistake and would lead us on an ephemeral journey. I think the larger question is, are we interacting with the world sufficiently, and are our questions, not everybody has to do this, there's still a role, I think, a very important role for pure theory, but are our graduate students getting out and doing the kind of field work that they need to do so that their theories are tested by an understanding of real people? The one thing I would add, also in the spirit of not despairing, because I'm not sure how much good it does at this point also, in addition to I don't think it being warranted, but I happen to be married to Cass Sunstein, who started as a constitutional lawyer and then kind of, I think it's fair to say, almost stumbled into the field of behavioral economics and behavioral science. And oh my gosh, to have the privilege of seeing what behavioral science has been able to do in the field of public policy to improve outcomes for citizens. I mean, it's been mind-blowing, and examples, studying, why are certain subgroups of low-income people so unlikely to fill out financial aid forms in order to be able to go to college, because they're would be dependent on financial aid, instead of just assuming they don't want to go to college, or they're too lazy to fill out the form for financial aid. If you actually talk to people, it turns out they were completely overwhelmed by the length of the form. And what the Obama administration did, with Cass and others behind it, is pre-populate the form with information that was readily available and shrink the length of the form to, I think, 3 pages. If you know in school cafeterias that the problem of obesity derives in part from the ease of access that people have to chocolate chip cookies and to French fries, if you actually just reorder where the fruit and vegetables are in the cafeteria and make it much harder to access the unhealthier food, it has a precipitous, it brings about a precipitous decline in calorie intake for people in public schools. And on issue after issue, you just see data and its impact in how people are crafting public policy, and it's awesome. But your question is fair. But I mean, I don't think we need to go so broad. I think we can just look at what are the set of questions now we wish we'd been asking, and what can we learn about ourselves that we weren't asking those, that will have relevance for the set of questions we should be asking today.
No, behavioral economics is certainly one of the things we take great pride in as a community of scholars. And it did loosen up the borders of economics somewhat, which was a little more tightly focused on its own models and so forth. And the models didn't quite predict and so
Anything?
forth. Yeah, right. And the humanities went through this remarkable period of deconstructionism where they talked to themselves only and had these fights internal to their discipline, and they weren't very active and present, if you will. And the whole, you use the word practical, but also moral. We've gone through a large, where we don't talk about morals very much as social scientists. And I think that's probably going to have to come back. See, I have to challenge you on something you said in your book about self-righteousness, about yourself. I don't think you were self-righteous. I think you really cared deeply about genocide.
I like that kind of challenge. That's my favorite kind of challenge.
Yeah. Well, but you was right to go after genocide, and you did you took a moral stance, not just a scientific stance.
But you can project in a way that it looks like you're impugning the values of others, and the fact is, when you're in policy circles, there are a set of incommensurable values. I don't mean to sound like a relativist, because I don't think that's my problem. But I think, just to be fair-minded and basically to be effective, also to anticipate what other values and even other kind of moral precepts others are bringing, and then meet them on their terms as well. That's all I really meant. Yeah. I say one other thing, actually, just because, I don't think I'm in as, I wouldn't despair, I think, quite as much as your questions suggest maybe some here are, and I wasn't aware of that, of the extent of that. But one thing that did really worry me was I was out at Stanford. I gave the Tanner lectures maybe a year ago, and I learned, and I don't have the numbers in my head, someone here probably teaches at Stanford and knows these numbers, but about the massive migration from the social sciences into computer science at that university. And as a liberal arts graduate, and as somebody who is so thankful, that I didn't sort of burrow myself, and that I learned how to express myself and how to think analytically, in different ways, and how I feel that served me. Where you have 2 kids, and raising these people, I hope, are fluid in the sciences, and indeed may even fall in love with the sciences, but that they would always be able to see the value of theater and literature and music. And anyway, so I was having that reaction, And then I had a great conversation with a man who was Avril and my colleague, a professor at Stanford, Jeremy Weinstein, who was my deputy when I was UN ambassador. And he's a brilliant guy and the master of applying ideas inside government. I don't know that there's anybody in foreign policy who's better than he is. But he was in the same kind of moment of, oh my gosh, what's happening? I used to have classes of this size, now they're skinny down. And he just said, I'm going to go co-teach a computer science and ethics class. And we're going to make sure that, every computer science graduate cycles through this line of programming. And his work was on comparative politics in sub-Saharan Africa. And it was a leap. And he had to, really almost take, a virtual sabbatical, a sabbatical of the soul, to really throw himself into that world. But that's also an example of, I think, what we can do at a moment like this. And the shorthand way of describing is interdisciplinarity, but there's something more to it, which is what our students are voting with their feet. What can we learn about where our society is going and how that should affect our teaching, and which is we sometimes don't talk enough about, and the lines of inquiry that we pursue in our research.
There are many people in the room who have got a lot to say on this question. So I'm going to open it up. I see I'm surrounded by political scientists, and I'm going to start with one, Bob Cohane. Yes.
So I thought it was a great talk, Samantha.
Thanks, Bob.
And I wanted to ask you if you would interpret, I interpret your talk as a call for renewed self-confidence about democracy and about social science. That is, that we should stop being too much kvetching about problems.
Admiring the problem.
And
yes.
admiring the problem. And both in foreign policy stating more seriously the superiority of democracy. After all, Lim said that autocracies are all thumbs. And Xi is all thumbs, and that's coming out. And that we should be thinking about social science, as Cass has, as a way of improving the quality of outcomes in democracy. Do I interpret you rightly?
I think so. I couldn't have said it better myself. And but there's so many dimensions of this. Just to tease it out, both you and I think we even talked about this. A book that I got a lot out of in recent years is Graham Allison's book, which is, I think, is titled Destined for War, but it's about Thucydides' trap and applying history to the present and so forth. I know it's controversial and people have different views of it. But one of the things that really struck me in reading that book, and maybe this is one of the critiques, I guess, is we know the flaws in our own and the brittleness of our own system. And autocratic societies and authoritarians, especially authoritarian societies, are often so closed to us that the kind of thought bubble of President Xi and what he's confronting in his society. We look at Hong Kong and we just think, oh, creeping China. Not one bookseller in Hong Kong now can sell a book that's critical of the Chinese government. The use now of lethal tools in the suppression of those protests. But part of this question is how do we also get inside of, I think if we, or maybe part of my proposition, but it's tentative because I haven't done it, is if we got inside and understood better, their sort of cost-benefit calculus, their forecasts for themselves, what they are managing. And I only mentioned Graham's book because, as he forecasts China's rise, he does some justice to what the Chinese state is having to navigate within its own borders, but really digging into that would be another source. I think it would be a comparator to what to the flaws that we're experiencing here. Because it'd be nice if we could not only be more self-confident, but have grounds to be more self-confident. Dig in other words, empirically in a way that would lead us to see, and I give you other examples. I didn't have time to go into this. It's again not my area, but on the question of gerrymandering, I could have gone into now what in the wake of the Supreme Court's horrific democracy degrading decision, seeing what North Carolina, sorry. what the North, this is my problem when you drag me into domestic social science. But what the North Carolinian institutions now are doing in the wake of the Supreme Court's decision, just saying, okay, if it's not them, then it's us. And it was North Carolinian judges who actually cited the dissent in the Supreme Court's gerrymandering case to at least improve the map. Maine now has a voter law, that basically makes your second choice count in a manner that, and it was just passed, in a manner that really should help, crowd out the extremes on both sides of the ballots. Because an extremist may get a lot of votes, but may not get a lot of second votes. And so, again, digging into these kinds of remedies and experiments that are going on also at all levels of our own democracy, and then making those more broadly known so it isn't, I do feel on one level the last few years we've been in a doom loop of admiring the problem and of the salience of all that is wrong with our democracy, not least, I mean, it's so easy to focus on, when facts don't matter, when science, as I saw it put in the New York Times by a doctor at Philadelphia Children's Hospital on the issue of vaccines. Some of you saw this article 4 or 5 days ago, and he said, science is but one voice in the room, on the question of vaccines. It's just one voice at the table. I mean, it's easy to focus on our problems, but I think to look again at the experimentation and at the ways in which people are trying to address different dimensions of polarization, division, and trying to render, at a local level or state level, and hopefully eventually at a federal level, our democracy more effective.
Just maybe one or two others. I would love to get an economist. Janet, did you have a question or anything you'd like to put in this?
No pressure.
No. Okay, fine, then not to worry. The problem is I can't see, the lights are such that
Maura Moynihan wants to ask a question.
Okay, fine.
And Maura Moynihan makes herself heard, like her pop.
First of all, I want to congratulate you, Samantha, for this. It was the most wonderful speech. I think everyone would agree. It was brilliant and amazing, like you always are. And my 90-year-old mother, Liz Moynihan, sends you her best wishes and regards and wishes she could be here. But as she's 90, traveling is more difficult. And Ambassador Peter Galbraith just returned from Syria and also sent you his regards. I thought I would take the mic to say that publicly to everybody. And before my question, I'll keep it short. The rise of China, which I'm so glad you addressed in your speech, wouldn't have happened without collusion from the Western powers, as everybody knows. And I mean, there's so many shocking facts that are now coming to light about how Chinese firms on Wall Street are not refused to be audited, and Wall Street lets them. That China steals $600 billion worth of intellectual property a year. If Russia, India, or France, or Japan did that, they'd pay a price. That China will never have its human rights record questioned at the UN or by Congress. And I've watched this my whole life, having gone to high school in India, and I went to communist China in 1975 when Chairman Mao was still alive during the Cultural Revolution. So I saw it, thanks to my father, and I just have found it absolutely shocking that the West has given communist China this easy pass. And so they're very much responsible for the rise of this authoritarian capitalism model. And where do you think it's going, especially given the uprising in Hong Kong, which I fully support?
Thanks. Well, thank you also for your very kind words. And again, just to reiterate how honored I am to be associated with your dad. But notwithstanding your kind words, your comments about the West also implicate me because I worked for a pretty powerful Western government for 8 years, and indeed worked day to day at the Security Council, of course, with China, a permanent member of the Security Council, which has the veto. And so, to address what you're describing, on one level, I think you have a point, which is that when it comes to a country as powerful as China, and even when it comes to a country far less powerful like Saudi Arabia, there have been these taboos in American foreign policy that have caused us, mean, sometimes it's not about whether we're confronting or not confronting. It's about whether we do it publicly or privately. But in the case of China, I think part of what's happened is the interdependence of our economies, which is a very, very different sort of structure of competition than it was when the Cold War was on and when your dad was vocal against the Soviet Union and other human rights abusers. Our economy is also very dependent on what happens in China. And so as you contemplate in 2019, let's say, I won't even look back at the last decade, but the measures that you will take, as we have seen with Trump's very confrontational approach, that has bearing on the lives of American workers, and it has bearing on the prices of American goods, and it now is having bearing on the slowing of the American economy at a time when people are already still are still reeling from the lasting effects of the last downturn in the economy. So, I don't disagree with you about the problematic reticence over many, many years about what happens inside China. And I think my own view is that in these decades ahead, where we have these two very powerful countries with very different systems, that our democratic model, and hopefully again, if we get on track a little bit better than we have been of late, notwithstanding racial injustice and exclusion and inequality here, that nonetheless, the fact that we have checks and balances and democratic institutions and a free media and freedom of religion and the rest, that these are going to be a comparative advantage in a competition of some kind between these two models. But at the same time, I can tell you from having worked at the Security Council and with China, there's almost no problem in the world, global problem, of which most of the problems that face us are in fact global now, that we can solve without China. And so again, one of the things that's bringing kids into the streets and having them activate around politics and wanting to change the system and render it more effective is climate change. We are not going to be able to deal with climate change simply by yelling at China. I couldn't get a single peacekeeper deployed to prevent sexual violence against women in a war zone or to prevent the recruitment of child soldiers if I couldn't get my Chinese counterpart on board because they have the veto. And, that's a structural problem in the international system, and you can be mad at the international system for being that way. But China, where we were going in our domestic debate, where basically the only thing Republicans and Democrats seem to be able to agree on is the irredeemable, badness of China. I mean, that's, if you look at the Democratic primary debate, if you listen, well, Trump goes back and forth, but if you listen to members of his administration and certainly Republicans in Congress, it's kind of it's a stalking horse now, and it makes everybody feel like at least we can unite on something. We can unite on saying how terrible China is. That's fine. There's much to complain about, as I did, as you did, but we also have to work with China. We have to look out for our own interests, and we're entangled with China. And so learning how to walk and chew gum, and challenge that government when it's appropriate to do so, more than we have, I think you're right, in the past. But while also carving out space to have a strategic partnership on issues that we can't do anything about on our own.
I'm sorry, we're on our deadline right now. The remaining thing to do this evening with you is to welcome you to the fellowship of the American Academy. And there are quite a few of them here tonight, altogether only 117, and so it's a very restricted thing. But obviously the Moynihan awardee is always a welcome member.
Thank you.
I will...
Thank you so much.
And
that's fair. Thank you. Thanks.
and for a truly stimulating and wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Good.
much.
Yeah.
Thank
Yeah.
you.